Winston Churchill famously said that democracy is the worst form of government except for all the other forms which have been tried so far. We have been told the story of democracy as a system of government that will facilitate a process toward a peace, stability, a sense of dignity and freedom yet unknown to man. We have been told that the fall of the Berlin Wall signified the end of history or the end of ideology, that the world has entered a new world order where the rule of law will supplant the law of the jungle, all under the banner of liberal democracy. We have been told that South Africa's transition into liberal democracy is a miracle that will secure peace and stability in the region. The fact of the matter is that we were lied to. Liberal democracy is not the knight in shining armor it was promised to be. Democracy is failing, and there are obvious reasons for it. Back in 1941, George Orwell warned us that democracy demands favorable conditions of life, that it has never flourished in poor and militarized states. Democracy and democratic liberty is not a sham, said Orwell, but democracy is not the ultimate solution our generation has been led to believe. A 16-year-old schoolboy can attack democracy much better than he can defend it, said Orwell, and one cannot answer him unless one knows the anti-democratic case and is willing to admit the large measure of truth it contains. Over the centuries, countless papers have been published about the different forms of government, the value of each, and the risks attached to each. In the 19th century, Alexis de Tocqueville warned in Democracy in America that there are certain inherent risks attached to democracy as a system of government. This includes the risk that self-centered passions will get the upper hand in a democracy, which could lead to a society where every person is so concerned about their own selfish interests that they lose sight of the greater good and of those things that are in the interest not necessarily of the individual, but of the community at large. Tocqueville also warns of the tyranny of the majority and the fact that democracy does not necessarily lead to freedom and might just as well lead to despotism. He called this the paradox of democracy. But Tocqueville wasn't the only one to warn about the paradox of democracy. Karl Popper said that the paradox of democracy is that the majority might just as well decide that a tyrant should rule. In his Vindication of Natural Society, Edmund Burke sketched the paradox of democracy in his signature language. He said, "An artful man became popular. The people had power in their hands, and they devolved a considerable share of their power upon their favorite. And the only use he made of this power was to plunge those who gave it into slavery." Much later, and in response to the claims about liberal democracy signaling the end of history and the end of ideology, Samuel Huntington described the paradox of democracy in slightly different terms. For him, the paradox of democracy was that democratic institutions, such as democratically elected governments, might just as well use their majority and democratically obtained powers to enforce undemocratic ideas and policies. This was especially plausible in non-Western societies, he warned. Huntington said, "Politicians in non-Western societies do not win elections by demonstrating how Western they are. Electoral competition instead stimulates them to fashion what they believe will be the most popular appeals, and those are usually ethnic, nationalist, and religious in character." More recently, an analysis by political scientists Nicholas Sharon and Victor Lepuente revealed that democracy does not necessarily lead to quality of government. Part of the problem with democracy, they pointed out, is that it is essentially a government that is based on the principle of supply and demand. For democracy to work, there has to be a demand from among the people for efficient, accountable government, and there has to be supply of such government. In other words, an aspiring governing party that fits the description of what constitutes an efficient, accountable government. In reality, we often find that democracy simply leads to a scenario where a demand for a bad government is met by a supply of political parties who are eager to step up. What do I mean when I say a demand for a bad government? Well, as Sharon and Lepuente points out, democracy tends to work in countries that are already wealthy and also in countries that tend to be homogeneous, or you could say dominated by one cultural group. In poor communities, people would easily vote for policies that provide economic relief in the short run, but that fail to sustainably invest in the economy. And we shouldn't necessarily blame them. The best example of this is social grants, or you could say socialist policies in general. It's easy to blame a wealthy person for voting for a party that pushes economically destructive policies. But it's not that easy to blame a poor person when such policies include giving the poor money to buy food. The problem is, however, that such policies might seem like relief for the poor, when in fact they simply serve to trap them in a cycle of poverty and government dependency. The result is that democracy can very easily lead to bad government, especially in poor countries. So the point of this video is not to tell you that we should do away with democracy. It's easy to argue that we should, but doing away with democracy is not necessarily the solution. What we ought to do away with is a type of democracy that is heavily centralized, that incentivizes corruption and economically destructive policies, and that traps people in a cycle of poverty and government dependency. Democracy can work, but for democracy to work, it has to be local, it has to be decentralized, and it should not amount to a scenario where people from different ethnicities simply count heads to see which group will have the privilege of ruling over the others. My name is Roets, and this is your fact sheet.